Hi, welcome to Stat Stuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll review the Change Acceleration Process, or CAP, model that outlines a change management method and set of tools for getting buy-in and ensuring successful implementation of the change. A couple prerequisites for this lesson include the corporate CTQ drill down and the ABC model. You may find the information in those lessons to be helpful in learning the concepts that we teach in this particular lesson. We'll begin by first defining the change effectiveness equation.
Well, from my understanding of how this began, it began with the company GE, who wanted to find out what makes certain projects successful. That is, they yielded the expected benefits. So they studied hundreds of projects and different business initiatives, and here's what they found. 100%, that is, all of the successful projects they evaluated, had a good technical solution or strategy associated with it. And then when they looked at the unsuccessful projects, 98% of all those unsuccessful projects also had a good technical solution or strategy. Well, it seems like it didn't make a lot of sense, but what they concluded was a good technical solution is not enough to make a project successful. So what is it that makes a project successful? Well, it's acceptance or buy-in of the change that they're trying to implement. So as a result, GE created what they call the CAP model, which is based off of a change effectiveness equation to help describe this kind of phenomena. So the equation looks like this: Q times A equals E. That is, quality times acceptance equals effectiveness. So we can describe this equation as the effectiveness, which is the E part, of any initiative is equal to the product of the quality, the Q part, of a strategy, and the acceptance, or A, of that strategy. Now, we're using a multiplication relationship in this equation because if the acceptance was 0, then the total effectiveness will also be 0, regardless of the quality of the strategy. In other words, it doesn't matter how good the quality is of the solution that's being implemented or being proposed. If you have 0 acceptance, it's going nowhere and it will not be effective. In the same way, you could have great acceptance and sponsorship. However, if the quality of the solution is also 0, then it also will not be effective. So since acceptance is really so critical, what GE did again was develop the change acceleration process, which is the CAP model, and created several CAP tools to help teach how we can get the buy-in necessary to successfully implement a change into the business. Now, the ABC model that was reviewed in a separate lesson can play a significant role in how we can acquire that buy-in. It also helps us understand the level of evidence our audience may need for their own decision making. And also, the more of our strategy's level of evidence meets or exceeds the audience's, then the more likely they'll accept it.
Now let's review an overview of what the CAP model looks like.
Well, first of all, this CAP model can be adapted to almost any major change that's going to be occurring in the business. So what we're going to go over in this lesson is to show how you can apply the CAP model and the tools, the different CAP tools, how we can adapt those to Lean and Six Sigma projects. Now, many of the CAP tools are the same as what's already used in other Lean Six Sigma tools, so they're not going to be addressed in detail here within this lesson, but those same kind of tools that are already separate within Lean Six Sigma are already covered in more depth in other lessons. So here's what the basic model looks like. Here we're showing that you've got a current state of where you are and transition state until you get to some future improved state. So this is the to be, where you want to be. So all along the way, for when you're going from your current state all the way to the improved state, you need to lead the change, and that's where it starts. And then you progressively work through these next set of items as you work from the current state to the improved state, and that is creating a shared need, shaping a vision, mobilizing commitment, making change last, and monitoring progress. Well, again, all along the way, the systems and structures are supporting the transition from the current state to the improved state. So what we're going to do next is break apart each of these different pieces to go a little bit more depth into each one.
Now let's take apart each section of the CAP model and explore them a little further in detail. We'll begin with defining what is meant by leading change.
Well, what do we mean by leading change? Well, in one word, it's sponsorship. So no project can be successful at implementing change unless we have committed leadership throughout the whole duration of the project. Leadership support should be visible and very active. So sponsors should be fully engaged in the way that they support the project by being aware of the need and providing the necessary resources in order to make the project successful. A sponsor may not need frequent communication or updates, so don't think that you have to get with them every day or every week or have constant communication, but you should at least ensure that they are fully supporting the efforts for the project, and they should also back up their full support. So what if you're finding that the sponsorship is waning, or maybe the sponsorship changes? Well, significant change in sponsorship support can be a serious risk, and that the failure of the project is going to be inevitable. So if you're finding that the sponsor is not fully supportive, for example, they're changing directions of what's important to them, or their priorities, or withdrawing resources, or maybe they're not fully engaged, then stop the project and make every attempt possible to make sure the sponsor is agreeable to supporting the project as you need it. Also, what if the sponsor happens to change roles? You suddenly have this change in leadership. Then again, you should stop the project if possible and make every attempt to make sure that you've got the support of that new sponsor who's taken that new position. And if possible, it would be helpful to include the former sponsor in a meeting with the new sponsor, so that way there's a smooth transition between the two of them. All right, next, what do we mean by creating a shared need? Well, it's the reason or need for the change that you're trying to implement. The need for the change must exceed any resistance or inertia in the organization in order to maintain the status quo. The change can also be driven by some sort of threat or opportunity. And the reasons for change must be compelling, not just for the leadership, but for any stakeholder who happens to be affected by the change itself. So how do you communicate this need to others? Well, the need can be identified and aligned like using the corporate CTQ drill down. Remember, the CTQ drill down helps align the lowest level initiatives up to the corporate need of satisfying shareholders. You can also communicate the need using the 3 Ds. First of all, there's data. That is the degree that internal or external sources of data show that there is a need for a change, such as with benchmarking. Also, demonstration, the degree that best practice sites or piloted projects show that there is a need for this kind of change. Or 3rd D would be demand. That is the degree which executive leadership is going to just simply demand that we make this change happen. Now, depending on the degree of change that you're trying to implement, that third one, demand, should be used as a last resort, because you could have some resistance from potential stakeholders. So how is it that you would handle opposition or disagreement of the need? Well, data and demonstration are only effective if the arguments are heavily weighted. So if you refer back to the ABC model, that's where we can help answer the next few questions to help persuade any opposition. For example, what are the opposing arguments, and how do the weights of their arguments compare to yours? And what other strong arguments, for example, like rewards of acceptance or risks of rejection, can be explored through this? And how can your existing arguments be reinforced to give them more evidential weight? Well, next we want to work on shaping a vision. So what do we mean by shaping a vision? Well, this is where we're painting the future, or that to-be state after the change is implemented. So the leadership, especially the sponsor for the project, must communicate that vision of what the world is going to look like after the change is implemented. Every journey must have a destination, or else you could be risking that everyone's going to be wandering aimlessly. So the vision that's painted must be clear, attainable, and widely understood. That end state that's described should not be described using business results, but they should be including behavioral terms, like for observable or measurable types of terms. Also, define the vision in just 1 to 3 sentences. Keep it really simple and direct, kind of like using an elevator speech. And the vision should be clearly understood by every single person. So try to avoid having lots of other individual visions. And then finally, ensure that the vision isn't too general or too complex. Either can cause confusion. Well, next we want to work on mobilizing commitment. So what do we mean by mobilizing commitment? Well, it's building a strategy where we can win the support of key stakeholders. So this is where we springboard off of the existing strong sponsorship we already have, the identified need, and the defined vision in order to rally the stakeholder support that we need. The objective is to build some momentum so that these stakeholders can be the advocate for change that affect these different areas. And if the change hasn't been piloted yet, then identify the stakeholders who could be those early adopters, so that way they can test the change itself, and you can identify and fix any unexpected errors or risks before you begin rolling out to other areas. So how do you build the strategy for winning stakeholder support? Well, first you identify who are your key stakeholders. And you could use like a stakeholder analysis to identify all the possible stakeholders and kind of predict what the level of support is that they're giving you. And for any stakeholders not considered to be strongly supportive, identify their potential source of resistance. And there are a few ways you can look at it. For example, is it technical kind of resistance? That is, they fear they lack the skills or resources to support the change. It's kind of their nature, or maybe they're fearing the unknown. Or is it a political kind of resistance? That is, they're fearing a loss of power, such as through influence or access to resources they've had, or access to authority that they used to employ. And this could create some power struggles. And then also could be a cultural type of resistance. They fear change in general, like the saying of, it's not how we do things around here. It's that old cultural mindset. And also then build a plan of what the order will be for communicating that change. You might want to begin with the strongest supporters and aim first for the lowest level of leadership, then to the highest. Now there's a give and take on this perspective, but the idea behind this is that the highest level of leaders very often lean on their subordinate leaders for input, because they're the ones who know the details and know whether something's going to work or not. So if they have that kind of support at the lower level first, then that can reinforce the message that you communicate upwards to the higher level of leadership in that chain. And that way you've already got the buy-in from the subordinate leaders, they're already in agreement, so it will be that much easier to gain support at the higher level. That's one approach, and that's usually where I would tend to favor it. But again, it might be different in different circumstances where you might have to start from the top down. And then assign each stakeholder the team member responsible for communicating that change. Consider also exploring why any stakeholders may be against the change. This may not be necessary, but this is where you can use the ABC model to help evaluate how you can influence those stakeholders. And then finally, you want to make sure that you validate your strategy with your sponsor to make sure they're in full agreement. Next in the CAP model is making change last. So what do we mean by that? That's integrating the change to the rest of the organization. So all the prior steps in this CAP model leading up to this change is where this really comes into play. It's the remaining steps from this point forward is where you're trying to make the change permanent. So this requires transferring knowledge and whatever best practices you define from the change to other key initiatives or any other competing initiatives. It also includes building momentum by celebrating any early successes you might have. Now the changes that are implemented should be baked in. That is, the change shouldn't be something that's quickly dropped once the organization gets in a pinch and they go back to the old way they were doing things. It should be something that becomes a part of their natural behavior of the organization. It's a new way of doing things, and when push comes to shove and they're back into a hard position, they press through and continue with this new behavior because they're already bought into this being the new way of doing it and the better way of doing it, and they won't resort back to the old way. So this isn't just something that's a desired behavior that we are desiring to have, but it becomes that new natural behavior and how they react even when they get into a pinch. Well, next in the model, we want to work on monitoring progress. So what do we mean by that? Well, it refers to measuring the results of the change that we're implementing. You might have heard the adage, you can't improve what you can't measure. So how do you know if the change that you're actually implementing is successful at all? There should be some clearly defined measurements that help reflect the before state now with this after state after it's been implemented. The measurements that are used should be real, that is, they should be objective to ensure that the progress that you're realizing is also real. Any benchmarks and goals should also be defined to make sure that you have accountability in how you're measuring that progress. You should also ensure that those measurements have teeth. That is, you should have a cause for celebration if you're seeing real progress as reflected in those measurements. But at the same time, if you're finding the progress is lagging or is declining in some way, then there also should be accountability to make sure that you can help turn it around. And finally, for the last part within this CAP model, it's changing systems and structures. So what do we mean by that? That's embedding the change into the whole organizational structure. So the current system and structure of an organization was what was designed in the as-is state prior to the change before it actually was implemented. Now, if those systems and structures aren't included in the change, then what you may end up doing is actually undoing the change and pushing everyone backwards to that prior state. So it'll make the change look like it was just a flavor of the month and it really didn't do anything at all. You really want to avoid that if possible. So the systems and structures of the organization may include several things, such as changes to the human resource type of issues like hiring or staffing or any training that's done. It could affect management issues like performance management or rewards or incentives for employees. It could also affect communication and documentation or even your organizational design, or also information technology architecture, such as with security or access or system design or integrations or those sort of things. So identify how these systems and structures influence the change behavior. So you might need to use a systematic approach to evaluate each system and each structure that may directly or indirectly influence the entire change. Then you need to modify all those systems and structures that pose as a risk or maybe a resistance to the change. And that way they can be modified in order that they now complement and reinforce the implemented change.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
I'd like you to think of a few projects you might have worked on in the past in your organization and ask yourself how much of the acceptance piece of the Q times A equals E has contributed to the success or failure of each of those projects. And in what way could more or maybe better acceptance have made each of those projects more successful? And what were some of the buy-in obstacles or challenges that you might have encountered in each project? And what could you do differently next time in order to prevent or maybe even overcome similar challenges in future projects?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out statstuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.